The land was forged from dust and silence. It stretched out under a sky so vast and empty it could break a person's heart. A canvas of bleached blue painted with the relentless glare of the sun. This was a place of harsh truths, where life clung on by a thread. Just like the stubborn sagebrush that clawed its roots into the cracked, thirsty earth. Jagged mesas, the color of old blood, broke the horizon, their stony faces carved by a wind that never truly rested. It was a sculptor of loneliness, this wind, whistling through the canyons in a low moan by day and rising to a keening shriek by night. It sang a mournful song through the splintered posts of broken fences, testaments to dreams that had dried up and blown away long ago. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the land from dawn till dusk, baking the ground into a fine, choking powder that rose in clouds with every footstep. It bleached the life from everything it touched, leaving behind a world of muted browns, grays, and the pale, ghostly green of cacti. Then, when the sun finally bled out behind the western mountains, the heat would vanish as if stolen, and a profound, biting cold would descend from the star-dusted heavens. Nights here were as cruel as the days were unforgiving, a cold that seeped into a man's bones and reminded him of his own mortality. On the very edge of this desolation, where the last dusty track of the town of Redemption faded into the immense, unforgiving prairie, stood Eleanor's cabin. It was a small, stubborn structure of graying timber, hunkered low against the wind as if bracing for a blow. It looked as weary and weathered as the landscape itself. A thin curl of smoke often rose from its stone chimney, the only sign of life for miles in any direction save for the town that had turned its back on her. Eleanor lived in a world bounded by the creak of her cabin door, the soft nicker of her horses, and the endless sigh of the prairie wind. Her days were a silent rhythm of survival. At dawn, she would be in her small, hard-won garden. Her hands, though slender, calloused and capable from working the unforgiving soil. She coaxed pale carrots, stubborn potatoes, and hardy greens from the earth. A small miracle of life in a land dedicated to dust. After tending her garden, she would care for her horses. There were only 3 of them left, remnants of a larger herd that had belonged to her late husband. They were her only real companions, creatures of simple needs and honest affection. She would speak to them, her voice a low, breathy sound, hardly more than a rustle of leaves. It was the only voice they, or she, ever heard. She avoided the town of Redemption. She had to, for her own peace. After her husband, Jebediah, had perished in the fire that consumed their larger barn 2 years prior, the whispers had started. A fire with no clear cause, a man known for his temper and his thirst for whiskey, found in the ashes, and a wife who emerged unscathed, her face a mask of shock but her eyes dry. The townsfolk, steeped in superstition and a grim sort of piety, found it easier to blame than to understand. The whispers grew from suspicion to accusation. Witch, black widow, a woman who brings ill fortune. The words were like stones, and though they were never thrown directly at her, she felt their weight every time she dared to venture in for supplies, so she stopped going. An old prospector named Silas, a man with more kindness in his heart than sense, would bring her what she needed once a month: flour, salt, coffee beans, leaving the bundle on her porch in exchange for a few jars of her preserved vegetables. They never spoke more than a handful of words. It was a transaction of necessity, shrouded in the silence that had become her life. Eleanor was a beautiful woman, though it was a fact she had long since forgotten. Her beauty was not the soft, delicate kind praised in the East. It was forged in the same fire as the land itself, resilient, stark, and compelling. Her hair was the color of dark honey, often escaping its tight bun to whip around a face framed by high cheekbones and a strong jaw. Her eyes were the startling color of a stormy sky, a deep gray blue that held oceans of unspoken sorrow, but it was her stillness that was most profound. She moved with a quiet grace, a woman who had learned to take up as little space in the world as possible, and her voice, Her voice was the ghost of what it once might have been. Words came from her in a hush, a whisper, as if she feared the very sound of them might shatter the fragile peace she had constructed around her broken heart. She was a fortress of silence, strong and enduring, but aching with the loneliness of her own exile. One afternoon, the world began to change. The relentless blue of the sky started to bruise at the edges, turning a sickly shade of purple-gray. The air grew heavy, thick with a tension you could almost taste. The wind, for the first time all day, fell silent. An ominous stillness settled over the prairie. Eleanor, leading her horses back from the small creek, felt the shift in the pit of her stomach. She looked to the west, where a wall of dark, churning clouds was building with an unnatural speed. A storm was coming, a bad one. She worked with a quiet urgency, securing the horses in their stalls in the small, sturdy stable that had survived the fire. She latched the windows of her cabin and brought in an extra armload of firewood. The first drops of rain began to fall as she pulled her door shut, fat, heavy drops that kicked up little puffs of dust where they landed. Then, through the growing gloom, she saw him. He was a silhouette at first, a figure on horseback moving not with the steady gait of a traveler, but with the weary, stumbling rhythm of an exhausted man. He drew closer, and the details emerged from the twilight. He was a cowboy. That much was clear from the battered hat, the dusty duster, and the worn leather chaps. His horse was a fine-looking beast, but it was lathered in sweat and favored one leg. The man himself swayed in the saddle, and as he dismounted near her fence, he moved with a stiff, painful deliberation. Eleanor watched from behind her lace curtain, her heart a tight fist in her chest. Strangers meant trouble. In her world, it was the only thing they ever meant. He tied his horse to the fence post and began walking towards her cabin. The rain was coming faster now, streaking the window pane, distorting his image. He was tall, broad-shouldered, but he carried himself with a slump of utter weariness. He stopped at her porch steps, took off his hat, and ran a hand through his dark, sweat-matted hair. For a long moment, he just stood there in the increasing rain, as if gathering the last of his strength. Then, he raised a hand and knocked on her door. The sound was an explosion in her silent world. 3 solid, definite raps. Eleanor flinched, her hand flying to her throat. Her mind raced. She could stay silent, pretend no one was home. He would eventually give up and leave, but where would he go? The storm was breaking now, the wind rising to a howl and the rain beginning to fall in blinding sheets. To send a man out into that, even a stranger— He knocked again, a little less forcefully this time. She took a deep, steadying breath, the kind she took before pulling a stubborn root from the earth, and opened the door a crack. He was standing right there, water dripping from the brim of his hat and the ends of his hair. His face was covered in a layer of grime, etched with lines of exhaustion and pain. His eyes, when they met hers, were a startlingly clear shade of blue, but they were guarded, wary, like a wolf caught in a trap. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across his left shoulder, the fabric of his shirt torn and matted with blood. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "Apologies for the intrusion. My horse is lamed up, and I saw your light, wondering if I could trouble you for some water, and maybe a place out of this storm. A barn, a shed, anything'll do." Eleanor's gaze flickered from his face to the wound on his shoulder and back again. Every instinct screamed at her to say no, to shut the door and bolt it. He was a drifter, a man with a wound that looked suspiciously like it came from a bullet. He was trouble, walking and breathing. But then she looked past him, at the fury of the storm. The sky had opened up completely. Wind tore at the man's duster, and lightning split the heavens with a brilliant, jagged fork, followed an instant later by a deafening crash of thunder that shook the very foundations of her cabin. To send him out into that would be a death sentence. Her own voice, when it came, was barely audible. a whisper swallowed by the storm. "The barn?" She pointed a trembling finger towards the stable. "You can stay there. There's a clean stall at the end." Relief washed over the man's face, so profound it seemed to drain the last of his energy. He nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Much obliged, ma'am. Truly." He turned without another word and limped back towards his horse. Eleanor watched until he'd led the animal into the relative safety of the barn. Then she quickly shut her door, leaning her back against the solid wood, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had just let trouble onto her land. She had invited the wolf to her door. That first night was a long one. Eleanor didn't sleep. She sat in a rocking chair by the cold hearth, a heavy iron poker resting on her lap, and listened. The storm raged outside, a symphony of chaos, the roar of the wind, the relentless drumming of rain on the roof, and the rumble of distant thunder. Through it all, she was acutely aware of the man in her barn. She had seen a faint, flickering light from his lantern through the cracks in the stable walls before it was extinguished. Now, there was only darkness. She imagined him out there, wounded and cold, and she wondered what kind of man he was. A bandit? An outlaw? Just a cowboy who'd had a run of bad luck? His eyes had been guarded, yes, but she had seen something else in them, too. A deep, familiar weariness. The look of someone who had been running for a very long time. It was a look she sometimes saw in her own reflection in the window pane on a dark night. In the barn, Isaac lay in the clean straw, his body screaming with pain. The wound in his shoulder was a hot, throbbing fire. He'd done his best to clean it at a creek miles back, but he knew it needed proper tending. He listened to the storm, grateful for the solid roof over his head. He had been close to collapse when he'd seen the faint glimmer of her lamp, a light in the wilderness. Hope. He thought about the woman. She moved like a phantom and spoke in a whisper. But her eyes held a storm of their own. He'd seen fear in them. That was plain enough. But underneath it, he'd sensed a profound and sorrowful strength. He recognized the look of a soul that had been wounded far deeper than his own shoulder, lying there in the dark, surrounded by the smell of hay and rain and the soft sounds of horses shifting in their sleep. Isaac felt a strange sense of stillness. For the first time in months, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. He was just a man, taking shelter from a storm, under the roof of a sad, quiet woman. The storm broke just before dawn. When Eleanor finally opened her door, the world was washed clean. The air was crisp and cool, smelling of wet earth and sage. The rising sun set the puddles of water scattered across the yard ablaze with golden light. She looked towards the barn. The top half of the door was open. After a moment's hesitation, she filled a basin with water from the rain barrel, grabbed a roll of clean linen from her chest, and found the small tin of herbal salve she used for the horses. Her hands were steady. Her decision had been made in the sleepless hours of the night. She found him sitting on an overturned bucket, shirtless, trying clumsily to redress the wound with his one good hand. The morning light fell on him, revealing a body that was lean and hard, crisscrossed with the faded silver of old scars. He looked up as she approached, his body tensing, his hand instinctively moving towards the gun belt that lay coiled on the straw beside him. Eleanor stopped, holding the basin out as a peace offering. She said nothing. Her eyes simply met his, and in that silent gaze, an understanding passed between them. He relaxed his hand and watched as she knelt before him. She worked in complete silence. Her touch was gentle but firm, her movements efficient. She cleaned the wound, her lips tightening at the sight of the angry, inflamed flesh. It was a clean hole, the bullet having passed straight through, but it was starting to fester. He didn't flinch or make a sound, though she could see the muscles in his jaw clenching, when she applied the cool, soothing salve. A low hiss of breath escaped him. She wrapped the wound tightly with the clean linen, her fingers brushing against his skin. The brief contact sent a jolt through both of them. a spark of warmth in the cool morning air. When she was finished, she stood up, her face as impassive as ever. He finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "You didn't have to do that." Eleanor merely nodded, gathering the basin and the soiled rags. Her own voice was a soft whisper. "It needed doing." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Isaac." She paused at the barn door, looking back at him. "My name," he clarified. "It's Isaac." She held his gaze for a second longer, a flicker of something unreadable in her stormy eyes. Then she nodded once more and walked back to her cabin, leaving him alone in the quiet aftermath of the storm. Isaac knew he should move on. A man with a price on his head, however wrongful, had no business staying in one place, especially not on the land of a woman who clearly wanted nothing more than to be left alone. But his shoulder was a ball of fire, and his horse still favored its leg. And there was something else, something about this place, about her, that held him, a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Later that morning, as Eleanor was mending a harness on her porch, he approached her, moving stiffly. "That fence line by the creek," he said, gesturing with his good arm. "It's down in 3 places, and I reckon your woodpile is looking a little low for the coming cold." Eleanor kept her eyes on her work, her needle pulling the thick thread through the leather. "It'll manage." "I'm a fair hand with an axe," he persisted. "And I can mend a fence post with one arm if I have to, for a few days' rest. And maybe some of whatever that was you cooked last night smelled mighty fine." He was offering a trade, work for sanctuary, a simple, honest bargain. She was silent for a long time, the only sound the rhythmic pull of the thread. He thought she was going to refuse. Finally, she looked up, her gray-blue eyes studying his face, searching for something. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "The axe is by the woodpile," she whispered. "Don't overexert your shoulder." And so, a new rhythm began. Isaac, despite the pain, proved true to his word. He spent the next few days working from sunup to sundown. He reset the fence posts, his movements slow and deliberate but effective. He chopped wood, the steady, rhythmic thunk of the axe, a new sound on the quiet homestead. He hunted, bringing back a pair of plump rabbits which they cooked and ate in a silence that was thick with unspoken questions. They rarely spoke. Words were not their currency. Their communication was in actions. He would find a bucket of fresh, cool water waiting for him by the fence line. She would wake to find her woodpile neatly stacked and higher than it had been in years. They moved around each other with a careful, respectful distance. 2 solitary planets that had unexpectedly found themselves sharing the same orbit. They began to grow accustomed to the quiet company. Eleanor found the sound of his work comforting, a human presence that wasn't threatening, that asked nothing of her but a plate of food and a place to rest. Isaac found himself watching her as she moved about her chores, a figure of quiet strength and profound grace. He saw the way she gentled her horses, the care with which she tended her small garden, and the deep, unyielding loneliness in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. They were 2 ghosts, haunting the same piece of land, each wrapped in the shroud of their own past. The silence between them was a vast, uncharted territory, and neither yet dared to take the first step into it. But in the quiet evenings, as they sat on opposite ends of the porch, watching the sun set the sky on fire, a fragile, unspoken truce began to form. They were no longer just a wounded man and a wary woman. They were Isaac and Eleanor, and in the vast, lonely expanse of the Wild West, that was something. The day settled into a new kind of quiet, one marked by the presence of 2 souls instead of one. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, watching them. It was a place of stark and subtle beauties, if a person had the patience to look. The dusty tracks that crisscrossed the prairie were like veins on an ancient, sleeping giant, leading nowhere and everywhere at once. At night, the world shrank to the small circle of light from Eleanor's lamp, and beyond it, The vast, breathing darkness belonged to the coyotes. Their howls would rise on the cold air, a chorus of wild, lonely voices that spoke of hunger and survival, echoing the unspoken ache in the two human hearts that listened. And sometimes, in the harshest, most sun-baked patch of dirt, a cactus would defy the desolation and put forth a bloom of brilliant, defiant pink, a silent testament to the fact that life, and even beauty, could flourish in the most unlikely of places. Isaac's shoulder healed slowly, the angry fire in it dulling to a persistent ache. He worked around the pain, his movements becoming more fluid, his strength returning. He explored the boundaries of Eleanor's property, checking for breaks in the wire, watching for the tracks of predators. It was during one of these solitary walks that he saw her. She was on the small, wind-swept hillock behind the cabin, a place marked by a single, gnarled cedar tree that had somehow survived a century of wind and drought. At its base was a small mound of earth, outlined with a careful border of river stones. A simple wooden cross, weathered to a silver gray, was pushed into the soil. It was a grave. Eleanor was on her knees beside it, her back to him. She wasn't weeping. Her movements were calm, methodical. She was pulling the small, stubborn weeds that grew between the stones, her fingers moving with a familiar tenderness. After she had cleared the last of them, she straightened the cross, then simply knelt there for a long time, her head bowed, a silent figure in communion with the silent earth. Isaac watched from a distance, hidden by a cluster of mesquite. He felt like an intruder, a witness to a private ritual. This, he knew, must be Jebediah's grave, the husband, the man whose absence defined this woman's entire existence. He watched as she finally rose, her hand resting on the wooden cross for a moment, a gesture that could have been one of affection, or farewell, or perhaps something else entirely. As she walked back to the cabin, her face was as serene and unreadable as ever, a placid sea over unknown depths. The sight of her there, so alone with her grief, stirred something protective in him. He wanted to understand the source of the sorrow that clung to her like a shroud, but he knew he had no right to ask. A few days later, he set about repairing the old smokehouse, a small, dilapidated shed that stood 100 yards from the barn. Its door hung from a single leather hinge, and several of its wall planks were rotten. As he worked to pry a warped board free, he saw it. The wood behind it, part of the main frame, was blackened. It wasn't rot, it was char. The burn mark was deep, cutting into the grain of the timber, and it smelled faintly, even after all this time, of soot and old smoke. He ran his fingers over the scorched surface. It was smooth, almost glassy, the way wood gets when it's been subjected to intense heat. He moved around the small structure, examining it with new eyes. He found more marks near the foundation, hidden by overgrown weeds, patches of earth that were still black and sterile, where the fire had burned so hot that nothing had grown since. He thought back to what Silas, the old prospector, had let slip on his last supply drop, that Jebediah had died in a barn fire. But this was the smokehouse, a good distance from the stable where the horses were kept, and the stable itself showed no signs of ever having been burned. A cold knot of unease tightened in Isaac's gut. The official story, the one the town believed, was that a lantern had tipped over in the barn, a drunken accident. But these marks, they didn't fit. It felt wrong. It felt like a piece of a puzzle that had been deliberately hidden. He looked over at the cabin, where Eleanor was hanging laundry on a line, the white sheets billowing in the breeze like captured clouds, a shadow of a secret, as dark and hidden as the char on the wood, seemed to hang over this whole place. He put the new plank in place, covering the evidence, his mind churning. He was a man who knew a thing or two about lies, and he was beginning to suspect he was living in the middle of a very big one. The necessity of supplies could no longer be ignored. The flour sack was nearly empty, and they were down to the last of the coffee. Isaac's horse was sound again, and his shoulder, while still tender, allowed for a full range of motion. "I can go into town," he offered one morning, watching her measure out a meager portion of flour. Eleanor's hand stilled. She didn't look at him. "No, I'll go." Her voice was a whisper, but it held a core of unyielding steel. It was her burden, her penance. She would not let him take it on. He didn't argue, but he insisted on going with her. "I'll not have you riding alone," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "I'll wait with the horses at the livery." She finally agreed, with a reluctant nod. The ride to redemption was tense and silent. Eleanor sat stiffly in the saddle, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her face pale. Isaac rode beside her, acutely aware of the invisible wall she had erected around herself. As the dusty cluster of buildings that made up the town came into view, he could feel her withdraw even further, shrinking into herself like a flower closing at dusk. He did as he promised, taking their horses to the livery stable while she slipped into the general store. He leaned against a corral fence, rolling a cigarette, his eyes scanning the street. It was a typical dusty town. A saloon, a blacksmith, a handful of false-fronted buildings huddled together under the oppressive sun. But there was an undercurrent of something sour, a pinched, judgmental quality to the faces of the people who passed. They looked at him, a stranger, with suspicion, their gazes lingering on the worn Colt revolver tied to his hip. He saw Eleanor come out of the store, a heavy sack clutched in her arms. She kept her head down, her bonnet hiding her face, and moved with a brisk, furtive pace, clearly desperate to be gone. She was almost to the livery when a group of 3 women, coming out of the dressmaker's shop, blocked her path. Isaac straightened up, his hand dropping from the cigarette to rest near the butt of his gun. He was too far away to hear the words, but he could see the venom in their posture. One of the women, a portly figure in a severe gray dress, gestured at Eleanor and said something sharp. The other 2 laughed, a cruel, high-pitched sound. Eleanor tried to step around them, but the woman in gray moved to block her again. She spoke, her voice louder this time, carrying on the still air. "Bad luck follows you like a plague. Eleanor, best you keep to yourself and not spread your misery." Eleanor flinched as if struck. She clutched the sack tighter, her knuckles white. She said nothing, simply tried to push past. It was then that a man stepped out of the saloon, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He was big and slovenly, with a florid face and small, mean eyes. "What's the trouble, ladies?" he boomed. He recognized Eleanor, and a nasty smirk spread across his face. "Well, if it ain't the Black Widow herself, come to town to find your next husband to burn up." That was it. Isaac was moving before he even made a conscious decision to. He crossed the street in a dozen long, silent strides, his boots kicking up dust. He didn't run. He walked with a lethal purpose that made people instinctively get out of his way. He came to a stop directly behind Eleanor, his presence a solid, unmovable wall. The big man's smirk faltered as he looked up at Isaac's cold, blue eyes. "She has business with me," Isaac said, his voice quiet, but with a hard, dangerous edge that cut through the saloon keeper's drunken bluster. "And you're in her way." The man, Jed, puffed out his chest. "Who the hell are you, her new fella? You best be careful. Stranger. Everything that woman touches turns to ash." "I said," Isaac repeated, taking a slow step forward. "You're in her way. Now move." For a second, Jed held his ground, his pride warring with the primal instinct for self-preservation that Isaac's deadly calm inspired. But then his eyes flickered to the hand resting so close to Isaac's colt, and his courage evaporated. With a muttered curse, he stepped aside. The women, their faces a mixture of fear and outrage, scattered like startled hens. Isaac put a hand on Eleanor's arm. his touch firm but gentle. "Let's go." She was trembling, her body rigid with a combination of shame and something else he couldn't name. She allowed him to take the heavy sack from her and guide her towards the horses. They mounted up and rode out of town, the hostile stares of the people of redemption burning into their backs. They didn't stop until they were miles out, deep in the silence of the prairie. The fury that had been simmering in Eleanor finally boiled over. She reined in her horse and turned on him, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. "What did you think you were doing?" Her voice was still a whisper, but it was raw, ragged with emotion. "Why did you do that?" "They were disrespecting you," he said simply, his own anger a low, steady burn. "I don't need your help," she shot back, her voice cracking. "I don't need a champion. All you did was make it worse. You brought trouble, just like I knew you would." Now they'll be talking for weeks. The widow and her mysterious, gun-slinging man. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" She was breathing hard, her hands clenched on the reins. He could see the turmoil in her, the anger at him for shattering her solitude, for dragging her into a conflict she had spent 2 years avoiding. But underneath it, he saw something else, a flicker of raw, wounded vulnerability, and a spark of something that looked almost like gratitude. She was furious, but she was also, for the first time since he'd met her, truly, vibrantly alive. He let her anger wash over him, understanding that it wasn't all directed at him. It was aimed at the town, at her late husband, at the cruel fate that had left her so isolated. When her tirade finally subsided into ragged breaths, the silence that fell between them was heavier than ever. He looked at her, at the fierce, beautiful, broken woman before him, and the question that had been haunting him, the one he had no right to ask, finally broke free. He had to know. He had to understand the ghost that stood between them. His voice was quiet, stripped of all anger. "Did you ever love him? Your husband?" The question struck her with the force of a physical blow. All the fire went out of her eyes, replaced by a look of stark, hunted panic. The color drained from her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Her gaze darted from his face to the distant mountains, as if searching for an escape. She couldn't answer. The silence stretched, taut and agonizing. Then, without a word, she jerked her horse's reins and kicked its flanks, sending the animal surging forward into a gallop. She fled from him, from the question, riding hard for the lonely sanctuary of her cabin, leaving him alone in a cloud of dust and unspoken truths. That night, the silence in the cabin was a living thing, a suffocating presence. Isaac ate his meal of cold jerky on the porch, his own appetite gone. He could feel her inside, a bundle of raw nerves and painful memories. He had pushed too hard. He had trespassed on sacred, sorrowful ground. Later, as a sliver of moon rose in the inky sky, he heard it, a sound so faint he at first thought it was the wind, but it came again, a choked, desperate sob from within the cabin. And then another. She was crying, not the gentle tears of sadness, but the wrenching, soul-deep sobs of someone whose heart was breaking, or had been broken long ago. Every instinct told him to go to her, to knock on the door, to offer some kind of comfort, but he stopped himself. His intrusion had caused this. More intrusion would not be the cure. He understood, in a way he couldn't quite articulate, that her sorrow was a private, walled-off place, and to force his way in would be a violation. She had been exposed and humiliated in town, and then he had stripped away her last defense with his question. What she needed now wasn't comfort, it was safety. So he did the only thing he could think of. He didn't go to her door. He didn't speak a word. He simply sat down on the top step of her porch, his back against the post, and drew his gun from its holster, laying it across his lap. He leaned his head back and looked up at the cold, distant stars. He would be her sentinel. He would guard her sorrow. He would stand watch over her fragile peace and protect it from the vast, dark emptiness of the night. He sat there for hours, a silent guardian, until the first pale hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. He must have dozed off, because he was startled awake by the soft creak of the cabin door opening. Eleanor stood there, framed in the doorway. Her eyes were swollen, her face pale, but the storm in them had passed. She looked at him, sitting on her step, the gun still resting on his thighs. She took in the scene, the empty porch, the quiet world, and the man who had stayed outside her door all night. She understood what he had done. He hadn't pitied her or intruded on her. He had protected her. He had given her the space to grieve in peace, and in doing so, had offered her a deeper comfort than any words could have. A change came over her face, a subtle softening of the hard lines of grief and defense. And then, for the first time since he had met her, a small, genuine smile touched Eleanor's lips. It was a fragile thing, as delicate and unexpected as a cactus flower after a long drought, but it transformed her face, letting a faint glimmer of light into the sorrowful shadows of her eyes. "The coffee is on," she whispered. He stood up, his joints stiff, and followed her inside. The cabin was warm and filled with the rich, comforting aroma. She poured him a cup, her movements no longer so tense. They sat at her small wooden table, the rising sun streaming through the window. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer a chasm of things unsaid, but a comfortable space, a shared peace. It was Isaac who broke it, his voice low. "When I was a boy," he began, staring into his cup, "I had a dog, a scruffy little mutt named Patches. Ugliest dog you ever saw, but he was smart, knew what I was thinking before I did. He got bit by a rattler down by the creek one summer. I sat with him all night, just like—" He trailed off, not needing to finish. Eleanor looked up, her eyes meeting his. Her own smile was a little stronger now. "I had a pony," she whispered, her voice still soft, but clearer, steadier. "My father gave her to me. Her name was Daisy. She had a coat the color of buttercups. I used to tell her all my secrets." And so they began. They didn't speak of husbands or fires, of wrongful accusations or lonely years. They spoke of small things, of safe things, of childhood memories, of the taste of fresh-baked bread, of the feeling of the sun on your face on the first warm day of spring. They exchanged these small, forgotten pieces of themselves like precious gifts, building a fragile bridge across the silence, one whispered memory at a time. The bridge they had built with their small, shared memories was a fragile one, and, for a time, they were content to stand on opposite ends, calling softly to one another across the chasm of their pasts. The rhythm of their days continued, a quiet dance of shared work and respectful silence. But the prairie had a way of forcing things. It was a land of extremes, of long, silent droughts and sudden, violent downpours. The storm arrived in late summer, rolling in from the west, not with the bruised warning of the last one, but with the sudden, breathtaking fury of an ambush. One moment, the sun was blazing in a white-hot sky. The next, the horizon was devoured by a monstrous, green-black cloud that seemed to boil with an inner rage. The air grew thick and electric, and a strange, metallic smell filled their nostrils. The wind came first, a low moan that quickly escalated into a frantic, shrieking gale, tearing at the roof of the cabin and bending the lone cedar on the hill almost to the ground. Isaac had been reinforcing the corral gate. Eleanor was bringing in the last of the herbs from her garden. They met at the cabin door, breathless, their hair whipped across their faces, just as the first massive drops of rain, cold and hard as pebbles, began to fall. They slammed the door shut, plunging the small cabin into a deep, premature twilight. The rain came down not in sheets, but as a solid, roaring waterfall, a deafening deluge that seemed intent on hammering the small structure back into the earth from which it came. Lightning scissored through the gloom, brilliant, terrifying flashes that illuminated the room in stark, ghostly detail. followed instantly by concussive blasts of thunder that vibrated through the floorboards and into their bones. The main room of the cabin, with its large window, felt too exposed. The wind found every crack in the chinking, and a fine mist of rain was being driven through the glass itself. "The kitchen," Eleanor said, her whisper barely audible over the din. It was the smallest, most solid room in the house, with only a tiny window set high in the wall. They retreated into the small space, huddling together instinctively. Eleanor lit a lantern, its warm, steady glow pushing back against the raging chaos outside. She moved to the hearth, her hands working with a practiced calm, and soon had a small, cheerful fire crackling, its light dancing on the simple wooden table and the copper pots hanging from the walls. The small room, warmed by the fire and the shared heat of their bodies, became a tiny, besieged island of peace in a world gone mad. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do but wait for the storm's fury to pass. They sat at the small table, the firelight casting flickering shadows on their faces. The roar outside was relentless. A particularly violent gust of wind hit the cabin, and the whole structure groaned in protest. Somewhere nearby, there was a loud, splintering crack, the sound of a large tree branch, or perhaps something more, giving way. Isaac stared into the flames, his face grim. The storm seemed to have stirred something inside him, a darkness that matched the one outside. "It was a night like this," he said, his voice a low rumble that was almost lost in the storm. "Thunder so loud it sounded like a whole company of dragoons firing their rifles." Eleanor looked at him, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea she had brewed. She said nothing, but her eyes, wide and attentive in the firelight, invited him to continue. "I was just a kid, 17, full of more spit and pride than sense," he began, his gaze distant. "I was running a herd up from Texas with my partner, a fella named Ben Carter. We grew up together, knew each other better than brothers. We'd saved for years to buy that herd. It was everything we had." He paused, taking a long, slow breath. "We were camped outside a rail town called Dusty Creek. We'd sold the cattle, and our saddlebags were heavy with coin for the first time in our lives. We were celebrating. Ben, he always had a taste for whiskey and cards. I didn't, but I went along. That night, in the saloon, a payroll box for the railroad was stolen, sometime during all the noise and commotion." A flash of lightning bleached the room white, and in that stark, unforgiving light, Eleanor saw the deep lines of bitterness etched around Isaac's mouth. They found the empty box the next morning, tossed in a gully just outside of town, and they found a footprint next to it, a boot with a broken heel plate. My boot. I'd broken it the week before and hadn't had a chance to get it fixed. He fell silent, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. "But it wasn't you," Eleanor whispered. He gave a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. "No, it wasn't me. But Ben, he was gone, vanished. And a fella at the saloon swore he saw me heading out toward that gully in the middle of the night. It was a lie. But with Ben gone and the proof of my boot print, it was a lie that stuck. A posse was formed. They weren't interested in a trial. The railroad put a $500 bounty on my head, dead or alive." He finally looked at her, his blue eyes burning with a cold fire she had never seen before. "So I ran. I've been running ever since. For 3 years. Running from a crime I didn't commit. Running from the ghost of a man I thought was my brother. He took the money, left my boot print for them to find, and disappeared. He betrayed me. For a few $1,000s. He stole my life." He slumped back in his chair, the story leaving him drained, hollowed out. He had carried that secret alone for so long, and the telling of it was a heavy, painful thing. He had confessed his innocence, but in the eyes of the world, he was a guilty man, an outlaw, an outcast. Eleanor stared at him, her heart aching with a fierce, unexpected surge of empathy. She knew what it was to be judged, to be condemned by whispers and lies. She knew the crushing weight of a label you could never escape. The storm seemed to find a new strength, and a blast of wind drove a sheet of rain against the small window with the force of a thrown stone. The sound startled her, but it also seemed to break a dam inside her own heart. The story he had given her was a gift of trust, and it demanded one in return. Her own voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper, but in the small, warm room, it was as clear as a bell. "My husband, Jebediah, he didn't die in an accident." Isaac's head snapped up. He looked at her, his own troubles forgotten, his full attention fixed on her face, which was pale and strained in the firelight. "He was not a gentleman," she began, her eyes dropping to her hands, which were twisting a loose thread on her apron. "Especially when he drank. And he was always drinking." She took a shaky breath, the words coming slowly, painfully, as if she were pulling them from a deep, infected wound. "He had a rage in him, a blackness. I never knew what would set it off. A meal that was too cold, a horse that wouldn't take a bit. Sometimes, nothing at all. He had heavy hands." She didn't need to say more. Isaac understood. The pieces began to click into place. Her skittishness, her whispered voice, the profound, bone-deep sorrow in her eyes. It wasn't just grief, it was the shadow of fear. That night, the night of the fire, he had been in town. He came home later than usual, full of whiskey and a special kind of poison. He was angry about a card game he'd lost. He tore the kitchen apart. He said he was going to teach me a lesson I'd never forget. Tears began to well in her eyes, but she fought them back, her voice remaining a low, controlled whisper. "I was so scared, more scared than I had ever been." There was a look in his eyes. "I knew if I stayed, he might kill me. So when he turned his back to get more whiskey from the smokehouse, I just ran. I didn't take anything. I ran out the back door and up to the hill, to the old cedar tree. I hid myself in the darkness and waited for him to come after me." She finally looked up, her eyes swimming with a terrible mixture of grief, fear, and something else, guilt. But he never came. Instead, I saw a flicker of light from the smokehouse, and then a glow. The glow grew brighter and brighter, and then there were flames. The whole thing went up so fast, the wood was so old and dry, and he kept kerosene in there. I stayed on the hill and watched it burn. I didn't scream, I didn't run for help, I just watched. And when it was all over, and the sun came up, I was a widow. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and terrible. She had not confessed to a crime, but to a sin of omission. She had survived, and a part of her, a deep and shame-filled part, had been relieved. "They called it an accident," she whispered. "Said he must have been drunk and tipped over the lantern. No one ever questioned it. But they looked at me. They saw I wasn't weeping. They saw the fear leave my eyes, and they started to whisper that I was cursed, that I had somehow wanted it. And in a way, they were right." Now the tears came, silent and hot, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. She didn't sob, but her whole body trembled with the force of her contained grief. In that moment, Isaac didn't see a black widow or a witch. He saw a woman who had been a prisoner, a woman who had escaped a living hell only to find herself in a different kind of prison, one made of loneliness and suspicion. He had been betrayed by a friend. She had been terrorized by a husband. He was hunted by the law. She was haunted by her own survival. Both of them were outcasts. Both misunderstood. Both living with a guilt that had no name. Their pain was different, but it was the same color. The storm chose that moment to unleash its final, most violent crescendo. A bolt of lightning struck somewhere terrifyingly close, the flash and the sound simultaneous. It was not a clap of thunder, but an explosive, ripping crack that sounded as if the sky itself had been torn in two. The lantern on the table guttered. and the cabin was plunged into a split second of absolute blackness, save for the dying embers in the hearth. In that instant of shared darkness and terror, Eleanor reached out. It was a purely instinctive gesture, a desperate reach for another human soul in the terrifying chaos. Her small, trembling hand found his. Her fingers closed around his calloused ones, a fragile anchor in the storm. Then the lantern flame righted itself, and the room was once more filled with a soft, warm light. They were still holding hands. Isaac looked down at their joined hands on the rough wooden table, then back up at her face. Her tears had stopped. Her eyes, luminous in the firelight, were fixed on his. It was the first time she had ever touched him willingly. It was a touch that said more than any words could. "I see you. I understand." They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, as the fury of the storm slowly began to recede. The wind died down to a mournful sigh, and the roar of the rain softened to a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof. They had weathered the storm, both outside and in. The morning after was a world of wreckage. The great cedar on the hill had lost a massive limb, which now lay splintered on the ground. A section of the corral fence was flattened. Debris was scattered everywhere. Leaves, branches, a loose roof shingle from the barn. But the air was pristine, scrubbed clean and smelling of pine and wet earth. They emerged from the cabin not into silence, but into a world of shared purpose. Without discussion, they began to work. He took the axe and began to methodically chop up the fallen limb, his swings powerful and sure. She gathered the smaller branches, her movements graceful and efficient. They worked together to right the fence posts, their hands often brushing as they passed tools back and forth. Every small action became imbued with a new tenderness. When he handed her a hammer, his fingers lingered on hers for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. When she brought him a dipper of cool water, her eyes held his, a soft, questioning light in their depths. They were not just repairing the damage from the storm. They were mending something in each other, piecing together the broken parts of their lives with small, gentle gestures of care. They were learning a new language, one spoken not with whispers or confessions, but with the quiet rhythm of shared work and the simple, profound comfort of presence. The sun set that evening on a world that was mostly put right. They sat on the porch, watching the last streaks of violet and rose fade from the sky. The silence that fell between them now was a different creature entirely. It was no longer a void, but a space filled with a quiet, shimmering anticipation. The secrets were out. The walls were down. All that was left was the truth of two lonely people, sitting together in the twilight. A few nights later, after they had finished a simple meal of rabbit stew, Eleanor disappeared into her bedroom. She returned a few moments later, and Isaac's breath caught in his throat. She had taken her hair down from its severe bun. It fell in soft, honey-colored waves around her shoulders, and she was wearing a dress he had never seen before, a simple dress of white cotton, old and softened with many washings, but clean and bright in the lamplight. It made her look younger, softer, like a ghost of the girl she must have been before Jebediah had crushed the light out of her. She stopped in front of him, a faint blush on her cheeks. Her voice was the softest of whispers, but it carried the weight of a monumental invitation. "The clouds have all gone," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "You can see the stars so clearly tonight. Would you sit with me? Outside?" He stood up slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. "Yes," he said, his own voice thick. She led the way out into the yard, to a spot clear of the debris. The night was cool and vast, the sky a spill of diamond dust on black velvet. There was no moon, and the stars blazed with a fierce, cold fire. They sat on an old blanket she had brought, not too close, but near enough that he could smell the faint, clean scent of soap from her skin and her hair. They sat in silence for a long time, their heads tilted back, looking up at the endless celestial display. Finally, she spoke. her voice so quiet he had to lean closer to hear. "I was always afraid. After Jebediah. Afraid of everything, the dark, the wind, afraid of being alone, but mostly afraid of another man, of being touched." She turned her head to look at him then, her eyes dark, bottomless pools in the starlight. "I'm not afraid of you, Isaac," she whispered. And then, after a small pause, she added, "Any more." The simple words were a key, unlocking the last bolt on his own heart. He moved closer, slowly, giving her time to retreat. She didn't. He could feel the warmth of her body next to his. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cool, but they curled around his, holding on. He looked at her face, at the starlight caught in her wide, trusting eyes, at the soft curve of her lips. He wanted to kiss her more than he had ever wanted anything in his life. But he knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that this was not a moment for passion. It was a moment for reverence. He leaned in, his heart thundering, and gently, so gently, he pressed his lips to her forehead. It was a kiss of promise, of protection, of profound and tender respect. It was a kiss that acknowledged her pain and honored her strength. It was a kiss that said, "You are safe with me." Eleanor's eyes fluttered shut. She didn't pull away. Instead, a soft, sighing breath escaped her lips, and she leaned into his touch, her body finally, completely, relaxing against his. The stillness of the night was no longer empty. It was filled with a quiet, breathless, and beautiful hope. The kiss on the forehead had been a promise, a question asked in the reverent silence of the starlit night. The answer came not in words, but in the way Eleanor's body, which had been a fortress of tension for 2 long years, finally yielded against his. She didn't pull away. She didn't retreat back into the safety of her shell. Instead, she stayed, a warm and breathing presence beside him, her hand still resting trustingly in his. The night deepened, the stars wheeling in their silent, majestic procession across the infinite black. A chill began to seep from the ground, and Isaac, ever practical, rose to his feet. "You'll catch a cold," he said, his voice a low rasp. He went to the woodpile he had so diligently stacked and returned with a few split logs. In the center of the yard, in a small, stone-lined fire pit that Jebediah had once built and then neglected, Isaac laid a fire. He worked with an economy of motion, and soon, a small, hungry flame licked at the kindling, growing into a cheerful, crackling blaze that pushed back the night and painted their faces in flickering shades of gold and orange. They sat before it, sharing the blanket now, their shoulders brushing. The warmth of the fire was a comfort, but it was the warmth radiating between them that was truly thawing the frozen landscapes of their souls. He could feel the fine tremor that still ran through her, the aftershock of her confession, of her tears, of his gentle kiss. He looked at her. The firelight danced in her hair, turning the honey-colored strands to molten gold. It softened the sorrow that was always present in her eyes, replacing it with a hesitant, questioning glow. Her lips, slightly parted, were the color of a wild rose. She felt his gaze and turned to meet it. And in that moment, the universe shrank to the small, sacred space between them. The vast prairie, the distant howl of a lone coyote, the blazing stars. It all faded away, leaving only the sound of the crackling fire and the frantic, hopeful beating of 2 hearts. He didn't know who moved first. Perhaps they both did, drawn together by a gravity that had been building since the moment he'd knocked on her door in the rain. His hand came up to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking the soft line of her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut, a gesture of complete and utter surrender. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of reverence this time. It was a kiss of desperation. It was the kiss of a man who had been starved for a gentle touch, for a taste of kindness in a world that had shown him only cruelty. It was the kiss of a woman who had forgotten what it was to be touched with anything other than anger. A woman whose body was an uncharted territory of forgotten desires. It was hesitant at first, a soft, questioning exploration. But then, a spark ignited. A deep, shuddering sigh escaped Eleanor's lips. A sound of release, of a dam breaking after a lifetime of holding back a flood. The sound broke something in Isaac, too. His arm slid around her waist, pulling her flush against him, and the kiss deepened, becoming a raw, searing expression of all the pain, the loneliness, and the desperate, aching need they had both kept locked away for so long. This was not gentle. It was a fever. It was the desperate, frantic kiss of two survivors who had found a life raft in each other in the middle of a storm-tossed sea. Her hands came up, not to push him away, but to tangle in his hair, to pull him closer still, her fingers clenching as if she feared he might vanish into the night. He was a man who had learned to be hard, to keep his emotions buried deep, but with her, he was defenseless. The taste of her, the feel of her soft, yielding body in his arms, the small, desperate sounds she made in the back of her throat, it was all unraveling him. He pulled back for a moment, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his forehead resting against hers. He needed to look in her eyes, to make sure, to give her a chance to say no. "Eleanor," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. Her eyes, when they opened, were dark and bottomless, shimmering with unshed tears and a fierce, blazing light he had never seen before. She was trembling from head to foot, not with fear, but with a lifetime of suppressed sensation rushing back all at once. She saw the question in his eyes, the hesitation, the profound respect that was warring with his own desperate need, and she knew that if she let this moment pass, it might never come again. This was a choice, her choice. Her voice was a ragged whisper, a plea torn from the very depths of her soul. "Don't stop." The words were all the permission he needed, all the reassurance his own battered heart required. He swept her up into his arms, his mouth finding hers again, and carried her from the firelight, away from the cabin with its ghosts and its painful memories. He carried her to the barn. He laid her down in the clean, sweet-smelling hay of an empty stall, the one where he had slept his first night here. The only light was the cool, silver light of the stars, filtering through the cracks in the walls and the open hayloft above. It was a rustic, holy place, filled with the simple, honest smells of earth and animals. He was gentle, so gentle. He was a man unmaking a lifetime of damage. His every touch a question, his every movement a reassurance. He undid the buttons of her simple white dress with hands that trembled slightly, revealing the pale, luminous skin beneath. He kissed the hollow of her throat, the curve of her shoulder, the sensitive skin of her inner wrist, his lips mapping a new world, a world of tenderness and care. He was showing her, without words, that a man's touch could be a thing of worship, not a thing of violence. And for Eleanor, it was a rebirth. Every touch, every gentle caress, was rewriting her history. She had believed her body was a source of shame, a vessel for another's rage. But under Isaac's hands, she discovered it could be a source of incandescent pleasure, of profound, shuddering joy. The tremors that ran through her were no longer from fear, but from an awakening so powerful it left her breathless. He was patient, his breathing as ragged as hers, his control a testament to the depth of his feelings. He was giving her back a piece of herself she thought had been destroyed forever. He was not just making love to her, he was healing her. And when they finally came together, it was a collision of two solitary worlds, a silent, explosive joining that was both a beginning and an end to the loneliness, an end to the fear, and the beginning of everything else. They moved together in the starlit darkness, two broken halves made whole, their ragged breaths and whispered names the only sound in the vast, sleeping silence of the prairie. Afterwards, they lay tangled in each other's arms, wrapped in the old blanket, the hay a soft, fragrant mattress beneath them. The roof of the barn had a small leak from the storm, and they could hear the soft, rhythmic drip of water into a puddle somewhere in the darkness. A sound that was peaceful, a counterpoint to the wild, chaotic drumming of their own hearts. Neither of them slept. To sleep would be to waste a single precious second of this new, unbelievable reality. They lay face to face, their legs entwined, their hands exploring, tracing the line of a jaw, the curve of a shoulder, as if memorizing each other by touch. "I never," Eleanor began, her voice a soft, wondering whisper in the dark. She stopped, unable to find the words. Isaac knew. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Me neither," he murmured into her hair. They talked, their voices hushed. Intimate secrets shared in the confessional of the night. They spoke of the scars on their souls, the fears they had never voiced to another living being. And as the first hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, he held her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "Eleanor," he said, his voice raw with a feeling so powerful it terrified him. He couldn't say the words. They were too big, too new, but she saw them in his eyes. She smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that seemed to light the whole barn. She leaned in and pressed her lips to his, a kiss that was soft and full of a deep, abiding peace. "I know," she whispered against his mouth. "Me too." The harsh light of morning brought with it the harsh light of reality. Isaac woke first. He lay for a long time, watching Eleanor sleep, her face soft and peaceful in the morning glow. A fierce, protective love, so strong it was a physical pain in his chest, washed over him. She was the most beautiful, brave thing he had ever seen, and he was a danger to her. He was Isaac, the wanted man, the man with a bounty on his head, the man who had brought a fight to her doorstep just by being there. Last night had been a miracle, a gift he didn't deserve. But to stay would be selfish. To stay would be to put this beautiful, fragile peace and her very life at risk. The whispers in town would grow louder. The law, or worse, bounty hunters, might hear of a drifter hiding out at the widow's place. And then the trouble he carried with him would descend on her, and it would destroy everything. The thought was unbearable. He had to leave. It was the only honorable thing to do. It was the only way to truly protect her. He slipped from her embrace as gently as a shadow, covering her with the blanket. He dressed quietly in the dim light, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. Every movement was an act of betrayal against the new, hopeful world they had built just hours before. He strapped on his gun belt. It felt heavier than it ever had. He went to his horse's stall, saddled the animal, and checked the cinch, his movements automatic, his mind a turmoil of regret. He was a runner. It was all he knew. But this time, running felt less like survival and more like cutting out his own heart. A soft sound from behind him made him freeze. Eleanor was standing at the entrance to the stall, her white dress rumpled, her feet bare, the blanket clutched around her shoulders. Her hair was a wild, beautiful mess, and her eyes, those stormy gray-blue eyes, were wide with a dawning, panicked understanding. She saw the saddle on his horse, the grim, set line of his jaw. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "I have to go," he said, his voice flat. He couldn't look at her. If he looked at her, he wouldn't be able to do this. "It ain't safe for you, me being here. You know that. I bring trouble." "I'm not afraid of trouble," she said, her voice gaining a strength he had never heard before. "You should be," he said gruffly, turning to make a final adjustment to a buckle. "I'm leaving. It's for the best." He turned to lead the horse from the stall, to walk past her, out of the barn, and out of her life forever. But she moved to block his path. She reached out and her hand closed around the worn fabric of his shirt, her grip surprisingly strong. "No." The single word. spoken not in a whisper but with a clear, unwavering force, stopped him cold. He finally forced himself to look at her. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a fierce, desperate plea. "Don't go," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. She took a step closer, her hand still clutching his shirt. "Isaac, please, I have spent the last 2 years simply existing, waking up, working, sleeping, just passing the time until I died. I was a ghost, and then you came." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. "Last night, this morning, for the first time in so long, I feel alive. My heart is beating. I can feel the blood in my veins. I don't want to go back to being a ghost." Her voice broke on a sob, but she pressed on, her eyes boring into his, willing him to understand. "I have never felt myself living until today. Until you were here. Please, don't take that away from me. Don't go." Her plea shattered his resolve. Every argument he had made to himself about honor and protection turned to dust in the face of the raw, undeniable truth in her eyes. To leave would not be to protect her. It would be to abandon her, to sentence her back to the living death she had just escaped. To stay might be dangerous, but to leave would be a cruelty he could not bear. Meanwhile, in the dusty town of Redemption, a stranger had arrived. He rode in on a fine black gelding, his clothes of a better cut than was usually seen in town, his face clean-shaven. He had a charming, easy smile, but his eyes were as cold and watchful as a hawk's. He dismounted in front of the saloon, handed the reins to a boy, and tossed him a coin that was worth more than the boy usually made in a week. He went into the saloon, ordered a whiskey, and surveyed the room. The saloon keeper, Jed, approached him, recognizing the scent of money. "New in town?" Jed asked, wiping the bar with a dirty rag. "Just passing through," the stranger said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Looking for someone. Thought he might have come through here. A tall fella, dark hair, blue eyes, a drifter. Answers to the name of Isaac." Jed's eyes narrowed. He remembered the stranger who had faced him down in the street, the man who had spirited the widow away. "Might have seen someone like that," Jed said cautiously. "What's your business with him?" The stranger took a slow sip of his whiskey. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "Let's just say he's an old friend," he said, his smile turning predatory. "An old friend who owes me something, and I always collect what I'm owed. My name is Ben Carter." Back at the cabin, Isaac looked down at Eleanor's hand clutching his shirt, then back to her face. He had been running his whole life. From the law, from bounty hunters, from the memory of betrayal. But looking at her now, he realized he was done running. He had found something here, in this small, forgotten corner of the world. That was worth standing his ground for. Something worth fighting for. He slowly raised his hand and covered hers, his fingers lacing through hers. "All right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll stay." He had no idea that the ghost from his past was no longer a ghost at all, but a man of flesh and blood, a man who was, at that very moment, asking questions in town. He didn't know that his decision to stay was not just a promise to Eleanor, but a decision to face the man who had destroyed his life. He was no longer just protecting a woman. He was preparing to defend his world. The decision to stay was not an end to the running. It was a choice to stop and face the thing that chased him. That grim reality arrived 2 days later in the form of Silas, the old prospector, who came rattling up in his rickety buckboard not on his usual monthly schedule, but with a sense of urgency that tightened the air. He found Isaac and Eleanor working together, replacing a rotted sill on the cabin porch. They were a study in quiet harmony, moving around each other with an unspoken understanding, their hands brushing as they passed a tool. The sight of them, so clearly a unit, brought a sad, knowing look to the old man's face. "Isaac," Silas said, his voice low and gravelly, dispensing with any pleasantries. "There's a man in town, at the saloon. He's been buying arounds, asking questions. A smooth talker with cold eyes. He's asking for you by name." Isaac stopped working, the hammer in his hand feeling suddenly heavy. He didn't have to ask. There was only one person it could be. "What's his name?" he asked, his voice flat. "Calls himself Ben Carter." The name fell between them like a stone into a deep, silent well. Eleanor looked from Silas's worried face to Isaac's, which had become a mask of stone. All the softness, all the gentle light she had seen in him over the past few days, was gone, replaced by a chilling, absolute stillness. This was the man he had been before her, the hunted, haunted stranger. "He's offering money for information," Silas continued, wringing his dusty hat in his hands. "Says you're an old friend who owes him. Jed, the saloon keeper. He's got a big mouth. He told this Carter fella about the row in the street, about you and Eleanor. He put two and two together. He knows you're out here. Isaac, he's just waiting." Isaac nodded slowly, his eyes distant, seeing not the porch or the prairie, but a dusty rail town and the face of the man he had called brother. He was not surprised. He had known, on some deep, primal level, that this day would come. Ben was not the kind of man to leave a loose end, with a $500 bounty still on Isaac's head. Isaac was a threat, a witness, a man who could, if captured, tell the truth. Ben had come to silence him for good. "Thank you, Silas," Isaac said, his voice devoid of emotion. He placed the hammer carefully on the porch rail. "You best be getting back before he sees you here." Silas hesitated, his gaze shifting to Eleanor, who stood pale and silent, her hand pressed to her mouth. "Son, you don't have to face him. You could ride out, disappear again." Isaac looked at Eleanor then, and a flicker of warmth returned to his eyes. He had made a promise. "No," he said, his voice quiet but final. "I'm done running." After Silas had gone, a heavy, terrible silence descended. Isaac went into the barn. Eleanor followed him. He was checking his Colt, his movements economical and precise. He spun the cylinder, checked the action, and began to methodically thumb cartridges into the empty chambers. The soft, metallic click-click-click of the bullets being loaded was the most terrifying sound she had ever heard. He was going to go. He was going to walk into that town and face the man who had stolen his life. He was going to walk into a gunfight. Her own past, her own history with violence, rose up in her like a choking tide. She thought of Jebediah's rages, of the helplessness, the terror, but this was different. Isaac was not a man of drunken, senseless violence. This was something colder, more deliberate. This was a matter of survival, a reckoning that had been 3 years in the making. He finished loading the gun and slid it into its worn leather holster. He turned to face her, his expression grim but clear. "Eleanor, I have to do this. As long as he's out there, we'll never be safe. I'll never be free." "You could be killed," she whispered, the words a knot of ice in her throat. "I could," he admitted, his honesty a cruel kindness. "But I won't live my life looking over my shoulder, and I won't have you living that way either." He started to walk past her, but she put a hand on his arm. "Wait." She turned and ran back to the cabin, her feet flying over the dusty ground. He watched her go, a frown creasing his brow. She returned a moment later, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold what she was carrying. It was a gun belt, old and stiff, the leather dark with age. The gun in the holster was a big Colt Peacemaker, its wooden grip worn smooth, its metal dulled. It was Jebediah's gun. She had found it in a locked chest after he died, had cleaned it and put it away, wanting only to forget the feel of it, the menace it represented. It was a symbol of all the fear she had lived with. He always kept it loaded," she stammered, holding it out to him. "He said it was a good gun, better than most." Her voice was a terrified whisper, but her eyes were resolute. She was offering him the weapon of her tormentor, the very symbol of her past oppression, and asking him to use it to protect their future. Isaac looked from the gun to her face. He understood the magnitude of the gesture. He took the gun belt from her, his fingers brushing against her cold, trembling ones. The gun was heavy, solid, a tool of death. He unbuckled his own belt and strapped on Jebediah's. It fit. He drew the peacemaker, checked its action with a practiced eye. It was a fine weapon, well balanced and cared for. He holstered it and looked at her. "Eleanor," he started, but he had no words for what he felt. She stepped forward and straightened the collar of his shirt, her trembling fingers brushing his neck. It was a simple, wifely gesture, an act of such profound and terrible intimacy in that moment that it almost broke him. She was sending her man off to a fight she knew he might not come back from. "Come back to me," she whispered, her eyes pleading. "I will," he promised. He rode to town, but he did not go alone. Eleanor rode beside him. She had refused to stay behind, her quiet insistence a force he could not deny. She would not hide in the cabin, waiting and wondering. She would face this with him, as his partner, as his equal. The ride was a slow, grim procession under a sun that beat down with a blinding, merciless intensity. The air was still and hot, the only sound the soft plod of the horses' hooves in the thick dust. When they reached the edge of town, they dismounted, tying their horses to a hitching rail in front of the blacksmith's shop. "Stay here," Isaac commanded, his voice gentle but firm. "No matter what happens." She nodded, her face a pale, taut mask. He squeezed her hand once, a hard, final pressure. Then he turned and began to walk down the middle of the main street. The town seemed to be holding its breath. Faces appeared in windows, peering out from behind curtains. Men who had been lounging on porches suddenly stood up, their conversations dying in their throats. They knew. The tension that had been building since Ben Carter's arrival was about to break. Isaac walked with a slow, deliberate pace, his spurs ringing softly in the thick silence. His eyes, narrowed against the glare, scanned the street. He saw Ben step out of the saloon. He was holding a glass of whiskey, a confident, mocking smile on his lips. He looked every inch the successful man, his clothes clean, his boots polished. He saw Isaac and his smile widened. He took a slow sip of his whiskey and then set the glass down carefully on the porch rail. "Isaac," he called, his voice carrying in the still air. "I had a feeling you'd come. I was just telling the good people of Redemption about our old partnership." Isaac came to a stop in the center of the street, about 20 yards away. The sun was at his back, casting his face in shadow, while Ben was caught in the full, brutal glare of the midday sun. It was a small advantage, but in a gunfight, small advantages were everything. "It's over, Ben," Isaac said, his voice as cold and flat as a stone. Ben laughed, a rich, self-assured sound. "Over? My boy, it's just beginning. You see, that bounty on your head is still active. I figure I'll collect it, tie up a loose end, and be on my way. It's just business." "The way it was business when you left my boot print by that lockbox?" Isaac asked, his hand hovering, loose and ready, just inches from the butt of Jebediah's Colt. "You were always the sentimental one," Ben sneered, his own hand drifting down to rest on his holstered pistol. "I gave you a choice. Isaac, you could have been my partner in a much more profitable venture, but you were always too damned honest." The street was utterly silent now. A tumbleweed rolled slowly across the dust between them. From the corner of his eye, Isaac could see Eleanor, a statue of white-knuckled terror by the blacksmith's shop. He drew a slow, steadying breath. "There's no bounty for a dead man, Ben," Isaac said, his voice a low warning. "Ride out now, and I'll let you live." Ben's smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure, venomous hatred. "You always did think you were better than me?" And then he moved. It was a blur of motion, but Isaac had been waiting for it, expecting it for 3 long years. He had played this moment out in his mind 1,000 times. Ben was fast, but his speed was born of arrogance. Isaac's was born of survival. Jebediah's gun, the gun Eleanor had given him, seemed to leap into his hand. It felt like an extension of his own arm, a righteous instrument of delayed justice. The sun glinted off the long, silver barrel. 2 shots roared as one, the sound a single deafening explosion that shattered the silence and echoed off the false fronts of the buildings. A burning, searing pain tore through Isaac's left side, just above his hip. The force of it staggered him, knocking him back a step, but his own aim was true. Ben Carter stood frozen for a split second, a look of profound shock on his face. A small, dark red circle appeared in the center of his pristine white shirt. He looked down at it, as if in disbelief. Then his knees buckled, and he collapsed into the dust of the street he had hoped to own. Silence, thick and absolute, descended once more, and then a collective gasp seemed to run through the town. Isaac stood, swaying slightly, his vision starting to blur at the edges. The gun in his hand was still smoking. He could feel the warm, sticky wetness of blood spreading across his shirt. Eleanor was the first to move. She let out a choked cry and ran to him, her feet heedless of the dust and the body lying just a few feet away. She reached him just as his legs threatened to give out, her arms wrapping around his waist, holding him up. The townspeople began to emerge from their hiding places, their faces a mixture of awe, fear, and a dawning, grudging respect. They had seen it all. They had heard the exchange. They had witnessed a man, wrongly accused, reclaim his life. The whispers that had followed Isaac, the suspicions, all died in that moment, in the acrid smell of gunpowder and the harsh light of truth. He was not just some drifter who had taken up with the widow. He was the man who had faced down a killer in the middle of their street and won. Silas was at Eleanor's side, his old face etched with concern. "Let's get him to the docks," he said, but Eleanor shook her head, her grip on Isaac tightening. "No, we're going home." As she helped Isaac limp towards their horses, a woman she had known her whole life, Martha, the baker's wife, a woman who had been among the first to shun her, stepped forward. "Eleanor," she said, her voice full of a new respect. He's a brave man." Eleanor just nodded, her focus entirely on Isaac. As she helped him into the saddle, she heard Silas's voice at her elbow. The old prospector looked her square in the eye, his gaze intense. "He risked his life for you," Silas said, his voice low and earnest. "For what you two have out there, I seen the way he looks at you. I seen the way you look at him. If you don't hold on to that man, Eleanor, you're a bigger fool than any of us ever thought you were." The ride back was a slow, agonizing journey. Isaac was slumped in the saddle, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his hand pressed tight against the bleeding wound in his side. Eleanor rode beside him, her arm around him, holding him steady, her heart a wild drum of fear and relief. She got him back to the cabin and half carried him to the bed. It was the same bed she had once shared with Jebediah, but now, with Isaac lying on it, pale and wounded but alive. It felt cleansed, consecrated, made new. She worked with a focused, desperate calm. She had tended to him once before, a stranger with a mysterious wound. Now, she was tending to her life, her future, the man who held her heart in his hands. She cut away the blood-soaked shirt. The bullet had torn a ragged furrow through the flesh of his side. It was a deep, nasty wound, but the bullet had passed through, just like the last time. It was a miracle. She cleaned it with whiskey, her touch gentle but firm. He hissed in pain, his body tensing, but he didn't pull away. He just watched her, his eyes dark with pain but full of a love so profound it made her own eyes burn. She bandaged the wound tightly with clean linen, her hands moving with a new confidence. Her work was no longer the hesitant act of a frightened woman, but the sure, steady care of a woman claiming her place, her purpose. When she was finished, she sat on the edge of the bed, her hand resting on his chest, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. He was alive. He had come back to her. She looked at his face, at the lines of pain and exhaustion, at the man who had faced death for her, for them, and the words that had been locked in her heart, the words she had been too afraid to even think, let alone speak, finally broke free. She leaned down, her lips close to his ear, and for the first time, her voice was not a whisper. It was a clear, strong, and unwavering sound, a voice reborn from the ashes of her old life. "I love you," she said, the words as true and solid as the earth beneath the cabin. She pulled back to look him in the eyes, to make sure he saw the truth of it on her face. "Stay with me, Isaac, stay here, and let's start over. Together." A single, perfect tear escaped from the corner of Isaac's eye and traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. And then another. He, who had faced down gunslingers and pauses, who had lived with betrayal and loneliness for years without ever shedding a tear, was crying. He was undone by the simple, miraculous power of her love, by the promise of a home, of a new beginning. It was a release of all the pain, all the fear, all the years of running. He was finally, truly, home. He reached up, his hand cupping the back of her neck, and pulled her down to him. Their lips met, and it was not the frantic, desperate kiss of the night before. This was a kiss of certainty, of solemn vows made without words. It was the kiss of two souls who had walked through fire and found each other on the other side. There was no more holding back, no more fear, no more ghosts. There was only the fierce, unquenchable heat of their love, the solid reality of their survival, and the endless, hopeful horizon of the life they would now build. Together. Time is a river in the prairie. It can run slow and stagnant for years, a muddy crawl through seasons of dust and silence. And then, in an instant, it can become a flash flood, a torrent that reshapes the entire landscape. For Isaac and Eleanor, the gunfight in redemption was that flood. It washed away the past, scoured the land clean, and when the waters receded, a new world was left in its place. The weeks that followed were a blur of healing, both of the body and of the soul. Isaac's wound, though deep, was clean. Eleanor tended to it with a devotion that was more potent than any medicine. She was no longer just his nurse. She was his anchor, his partner, and as the color returned to his cheeks and the strength to his limbs, the homestead itself began to heal with him. The silence that had once defined the place, a heavy shroud of grief and fear, was replaced by new sounds. The rhythmic rasp of a saw as Isaac repaired the porch, the steady, cheerful thud of Eleanor's hoe in an expanding garden, and, most miraculous of all, the sound of quiet laughter. A sound so foreign and so beautiful, it seemed to make the wildflowers grow a little brighter. They worked from sunup to sundown, not with the grim determination of survivors, but with the joyful energy of architects building their future. The cabin, which had been a fortress for Eleanor's loneliness, became a home. He repaired the leaky roof and chinked the walls against the coming winter winds. She filled the small space with the smells of baking bread and simmering stew, aromas of life and comfort that chased the last of the ghosts from the corners. They were rebuilding more than a farm. They were rebuilding a world, a small, two-person kingdom carved out of the wilderness. One day, Isaac returned from a trip to a settlement further west, leading not one, but two new horses, a strong, sturdy gelding for himself, and a fine, spirited mare with a coat the color of firelight. "For you," he said, handing the reins to Eleanor. She looked at the mare, her eyes wide. It was the first beautiful, unnecessary thing she had owned in her adult life. She ran a hand down the horse's soft nose, and the animal nickered, nudging her palm. "But the money?" she whispered, thinking of their meager savings. "It's an investment," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a smile that now came so easily. "We're not just surviving anymore. "Eleanor, we're building. We need good stock." They expanded the corrals, their 4 horses now a small but proud herd, the sight of them grazing in the pasture, their coats shining in the sun, was a daily testament to their progress. Life was no longer about holding on. It was about growing. Their relationship, born in the crucible of violence and confession, settled into a deep and profound intimacy. They had already shared their darkest secrets, and with that terrible weight gone, they were free to discover the simple, everyday joys of each other. He learned that she had a wry, subtle sense of humor that would emerge when she was relaxed. She learned that behind his quiet, stoic exterior was a man of deep and gentle kindness, a man who would stop his work to watch a hawk circle in the sky, or who would bring her a single, perfect cactus flower he had found on the prairie. They fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. They could work together for hours in comfortable silence, each knowing what the other needed without a word being spoken. And at night, they would lie in each other's arms, the bed no longer a place of ghosts, but a sanctuary of warmth and love. And they would talk, sharing the small stories and simple dreams that they had never dared to voice before. But the town of Redemption had not forgotten them. While most people had accepted the truth of the gunfight and now treated Isaac with a wary respect, there were still pockets of the old bitterness, the old judgment. The story had been set, and some people were unwilling to read a new chapter. To them, Eleanor was still the Black Widow, and Isaac was the gunslinger she had taken in. Their new life was a scandal, a defiance of the town's grim, unspoken rules. "The widow and the wanted man," was the phrase, whispered behind cupped hands in the general store. It was a brand, a label they tried to press onto the new life Isaac and Eleanor were building, a way to keep them in the box of outcasts where the town felt they belonged. For a long time, Isaac and Eleanor ignored it. Their world was the homestead. The opinions of the town were like the wind, a meaningless noise on the other side of their fence. They had everything they needed right here. One autumn afternoon, Eleanor decided she wanted to start a school. The idea had been growing in her for weeks. On her infrequent trips to town, she had seen them, the children with dusty faces and patched clothes, some of them orphans from sickness or accident, children who were growing up as wild and untended as the sagebrush. She saw in them a reflection of her own lonely past, and her heart, which had been so carefully guarded for so long, ached for them. She brought the idea to Isaac as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set. "There's so much space here," she said, her voice soft but filled with a new, quiet passion. "And that old bunkhouse, we could fix it up. I could teach them to read, to write. We could give them a place to be safe, to have a chance." Isaac looked at her, at the earnest, hopeful light in her eyes. He, who had never had a real home, who had been cast out and forced to make his way alone since he was a boy, understood immediately. This was not just about charity. It was about creating a sanctuary. It was about taking the life they had built for themselves and using it to shelter others. "It's a fine idea," he said, taking her hand. "The finest I've ever heard." The decision solidified their future. They were no longer just a couple. They were becoming a family, a foundation. But the plan required supplies, lumber, books, slates, and that required a trip to town. Isaac was planning to go with a rancher from a neighboring spread to look at some cattle, a trip that would take him away for 2 days. "I'll go," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "I need to speak with the storekeeper to see what he can order." Isaac hesitated. "Are you sure you don't have to go alone?" She looked at him, and he saw the quiet strength in her eyes, the strength he had seen in her on the day of the gunfight. "I'm sure," she said. "I'm not afraid of that town anymore." The next day, she rode into Redemption alone, her back straight, her head held high. She tied her mare, Firefly, outside the general store and walked inside. The few people in the store fell silent, their eyes following her. The old whispers seemed to hang in the air, a palpable chill. But Eleanor did not flinch. She walked to the counter, her boots making a solid, determined sound on the wooden floor. She was discussing her list with the storekeeper when the door opened and a woman entered. It was Mrs. Gable, the same severe-looking woman in the gray dress who had confronted her on the street weeks ago. Her face, already pinched and sour, tightened into a mask of disapproval when she saw Eleanor. She ignored the storekeeper and addressed Eleanor directly, her voice loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "Well, she said, her tone dripping with sanctimonious venom. "Look what the wind blew in. I suppose when your gunslinger is away, you have to run your own errands. Some women are just born to attract trouble, aren't they? First a husband who burns up in a fire. Now a wanted killer. You have no sense of decency. Do you, Eleanor?" The store went deathly quiet. Everyone was watching, waiting. The old Eleanor would have shrunk, would have whispered an apology and fled. The old Eleanor would have let the shame and the judgment crush her. But the old Eleanor was gone. She turned slowly to face Mrs. Gable. She did not raise her voice. She did not tremble. She stood tall, her gaze calm and direct. And when she spoke, her voice was as clear and steady as a church bell on a Sunday morning. "You are right about one thing, Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice resonating with a quiet, unshakable authority. "I have attracted trouble, and I have known great sorrow, but what you call a lack of decency, I call survival, and what you call a wanted killer, I call a good and honorable man who saved my life, and who was proven innocent right here in the street of your decent town." She took a step closer, her eyes never leaving the other woman's face. "You have judged me from the day my husband died. You and this whole town. You whispered and you pointed fingers, and you left me to drown in my grief. You talk of decency, but there was no decency in that. There was only cruelty and fear." A flush crept up Mrs. Gable's neck. She opened her mouth to speak, but Eleanor continued, her voice softening, but losing none of its power. "I have spent years living with the weight of your judgment and the weight of my own guilt. But I am done. I don't need your forgiveness for the life I am building. I don't need this town's permission to be happy." She paused, and her next words were for herself as much as for the woman in front of her. "I don't need anyone's forgiveness. Mrs. Gable, I have finally forgiven myself." With that, she turned her back on the stunned, silent woman. She finished her business with the storekeeper, her hands steady, her voice calm. Then she walked out of the store, her head held high, and mounted her horse. She did not look back. She had faced the last of her ghosts, not with a gun, but with the simple, unassailable power of the truth. That evening, when Isaac returned, he found her on the small hill behind the cabin, by the gnarled cedar tree. It was the place where she had once hidden in terror, the place where she had knelt in lonely grief at Jebediah's grave. The grave was still there, the simple wooden cross a silent testament to a past that could not be erased, but it no longer dominated the landscape of her heart. It was just a part of the story now, the dark chapter that had, by some strange and painful miracle, led to the light. She was watching the sunset, a spectacular blaze of orange, purple, and gold that set the entire prairie on fire. The world was vast and beautiful and full of a profound and endless peace. She felt him come up behind her. He didn't speak, just wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, her hand covering his. They stood together like that for a long time, two people who had become one, watching the day die and the stars begin to prick the darkening velvet of the sky. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice soft with contentment. "I used to come up here and think this was the loneliest place on earth. I thought I would die up here, alone." "You're not alone anymore," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He pressed a kiss to her hair. She smiled, a slow, genuine smile of pure happiness. She turned her head to look up at him. her eyes shining in the twilight. "Do you know," she said, her voice a marvel of wonder, "I lived for so long in a world of silence. I was so afraid to make a sound. I used to only know how to whisper." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "But now," she said, her voice growing stronger, filled with a joy so powerful it was breathtaking. "Now I feel like I could stand on this hill and shout it to the whole world. I love you, Isaac." He lowered his head and kissed her, a deep, lingering kiss that was full of promises kept and futures yet to be lived. The scars of their pasts were still there, etched into their souls like the lines on the ancient mesas. They would always carry them. But the scars were no longer wounds. They were reminders of what they had survived, of the strength they had found, of the improbable, miraculous love that had bloomed in the harshest of lands. The next morning, they saddled their horses. They were not running from anything anymore. They were riding towards everything. They rode out together, away from the last lingering shadows of the dusty town. Their face turned towards the endless sunlit horizon. They rode side by side, two solitary souls who had found their home not in a place, but in each other. Their love a constant, burning star in the vast, wild beauty of the West. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. We love to know where our stories are reaching, so please, leave a comment and let us know where in the world you're listening from. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel for more tales from the frontier, and be sure to share your thoughts on Eleanor and Isaac's journey.